She dropped the suitcase at the ranch gate and said nothing. Just stood there in the cold with cracked boots and hollow eyes, waiting to be turned away like she had been everywhere else. Samuel Carter stepped off his porch, looked at her once, and said, "You hungry?" She didn't answer. She just nodded. That single nod told him everything he needed to know, and nothing she would ever say out loud. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The ranch hand saw her first. Ed Briggs spotted her from the fence post where he'd been hammering nails since before sunup, and he stopped mid-swing. Holt Carver saw her from the water trough, and he straightened up slow, the way a man does when he isn't sure what he's looking at. Billy Fess, the youngest of them, barely 19, just stared with his mouth open until Ed elbowed him in the ribs. A woman standing at the gate of Carter Ranch was not an ordinary sight. Samuel Carter came out of the barn, with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and oil on his hands from the harness he'd been mending. He heard the quiet before he saw her, that particular silence that drops over working men when something unexpected appears. She was young, late 20s at most, worn coat brown and faded, with 2 buttons missing from the middle. A suitcase that had seen better years sat at her feet, its leather strap tied with twine where the buckle had broken. Her boots were cracked along the left toe. Her hair was pinned back in a way that said she'd done it herself. In the dark, without a mirror, because there wasn't time. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was just standing there, straight-backed and still, like a woman who had learned that composure was the only currency she could afford. Samuel walked toward the gate. The hands watched. "You lost?" he asked. "No, sir," she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised him. "I heard in town that you run a working ranch." "That's right. I'm looking for work. I can cook, clean, mend, tend animals, and I don't complain. I'm not asking for much. Just a wage and a place to sleep that isn't a barn floor." A pause. "Although I've slept on barn floors before, if that's what's available." Ed Briggs made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a cough. Samuel didn't look at him. "What's your name?" "Clara Bennett." "Where are you from?" "Clara Bennett? Missouri, originally. I've been moving around." She said it plainly, like it was just a fact and not a wound. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the suitcase. He looked at the boots. He looked at her hands, which were folded in front of her, and he could see from 20 feet away that her knuckles were rough and her palms were calloused the way a working woman's hands get when she has spent years working for people who never said thank you. "You eaten today?" She hesitated just a fraction of a second. "I'm fine." That hesitation, that fraction of a second. It answered his question. "Come inside," he said, and unlatched the gate. She picked up her own suitcase before any of the hands could move to help her. Carried it herself, straight through the gate, and up the path toward the house. And she didn't look at any of them, not out of rudeness. Out of practice, she had learned not to make eye contact with men who might change their minds. "She won't last a week," Holt muttered. Samuel heard it. He didn't respond. He just followed her up the path and held the front door open. Margaret Yates, who cooked for the ranch 3 days a week and had opinions about everything, was standing at the kitchen counter when they came in. She looked at Clara the way a woman looks at another woman, fast and thorough, and her expression shifted from suspicion to something closer to recognition. "This is Clara Bennett," Samuel said. "She'll be working with us for a while." "Margaret, is there anything left from this morning?" "Biscuits and cold beans," Margaret said. "That's fine," Clara said immediately. "I'm not particular." She sat where Samuel gestured, at the end of the kitchen table, and she didn't ask for butter or salt or a napkin. She ate what was put in front of her with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to eat fast before it was taken away. Samuel sat across from her with a cup of coffee and watched without appearing to watch. Halfway through the plate, Clara looked up. "I should be clear about something. Mr. Carter, I'm a good worker. I'll outwork most of your men when it comes to indoor work. And I can pull my weight outdoors too, in a pinch. But I'm not looking for charity. If I'm not useful, I'll go. I won't make a fuss about it. All right, Samuel said. I mean it. I've been in situations where people kept someone on out of pity. And it goes badly for everyone. If I'm not what you need, just say so and I'll pack up Clara. She stopped. Finish your food, he said. She looked at him for a moment. And then she looked back down at her plate. She finished the biscuits and beans without saying anything else. He showed her the storage room off the back hallway. It was small, hardly bigger than a generous closet with a cot, a single wool blanket, and a hook on the wall. There was a window the size of a piece of paper that looked out onto the woodpile. There's a proper guest room upstairs, Samuel said. I can put you there instead. This is perfect, Clara said. She set her suitcase down and turned to face him. This is genuinely perfect. Thank you. He looked at the cot. He looked at the window. He thought about the guest room upstairs, which had a brass bed and curtains, and a view of the mountain range. It's not perfect, he said. It has 4 walls and a door that closes. That's more than I need. She said it without bitterness. She said it like a simple fact. I'll be ready to start first thing in the morning. Samuel left her to settle in. He stood in the hallway outside the closed door for a moment, listening to the faint sounds of a woman arranging the very little that she owned into a very small space. And something in his chest did something it hadn't done in a long time. It tightened. He went to his office and stared at nothing for a while. By 4 in the morning, Clara was already in the kitchen. Margaret arrived at 6, as she always did, and stopped dead in the doorway. The stove was lit. Coffee was made. Biscuit dough was rolled and cut and in the oven. The kitchen floor had been swept. Clara was sitting at the table mending her own coat sleeve, moving the needle through the cloth with practiced ease. And she looked up without expression. Good morning. The coffee should be strong enough. I didn't know how you prefer it. Margaret stood in her own kitchen, in a space she had ruled for 3 years, and stared at this small, quiet woman who had been there 6 hours and already rearranged everything. It smells good, Margaret finally said. The biscuits have a bit more butter than usual. I found some in the cold chest that needed using before it turned. Clara bit the thread with her teeth and examined her stitching. I hope that's all right. Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee. She drank it. She closed her eyes for a moment. She opened them. Girl, she said, where did you come from? Clara folded her coat. Missouri. Originally. She stood and went to check on the biscuits. By the end of the first week, 3 things had changed at Carter Ranch. First, the smell. Not a bad smell before a barn smell, a working smell. Coffee and leather and wood smoke, but now there was something layered underneath it. Something warmer. Bread. Dried herbs hanging near the window. Beeswax on the table surfaces. Second, the kitchen organization. Clara had said nothing to Margaret, had not moved or rearranged a single item. But she had asked questions. Small questions. Quiet questions. Where do you usually keep the flour when the delivery comes in? Is it easier for you to have the large pots here or there? Does Mr. Carter take breakfast before or after the hands? And gradually, without anyone declaring it, the kitchen had become slightly more logical, slightly more efficient, and Margaret had noticed, but couldn't quite explain how it had happened. Third, the animals. One of the ranch dogs, a 3-legged cattle dog named Patch, who had been surly and half feral since losing his leg to a wagon wheel, had started following Clara everywhere. He slept outside the storage room door. When Clara walked to the barn to collect eggs from the 3 laying hens, Patch walked beside her. Holt Carver watched this from a distance and told Ed Briggs, "That dog doesn't like anybody." Ed watched Clara crouch down to check the leg of an injured calf without being asked, running her hands along the joint with careful attention while the calf stood still. "That dog has sense," Ed said. Samuel saw her in the barn on the 8th day. She didn't know he was there. She was standing in one of the stalls with her back to the door, talking in a low voice to the injured calf, which had stopped eating for 2 days and had everyone worried. She wasn't doing anything extraordinary. She was just talking to it. her hand on its neck, her voice low and steady, saying the kind of things you say when you're trying to convince someone small and frightened that they're safe now. Samuel stood in the barn doorway and didn't go in. He stood there until she finished, and then he went back to the house without her seeing him. That evening at supper, he said, "The calf ate this afternoon." Clara looked up from her plate. "I noticed," she said, and looked back down. Holt Carver looked at Ed Briggs. Ed Briggs said nothing. "She doesn't take her full wage," Margaret told Samuel on Saturday morning. He set down his coffee cup. "What do you mean?" "I mean she takes less. I watched her when you leave the week's wages on the table. She takes 2/3 of what's there and leaves the rest. I asked her about it, and she said she didn't feel she'd earned the full amount because she'd spent the afternoon in the barn with the calf instead of doing her regular work." Samuel was quiet. "Samuel," Margaret said, and she only used his first name when she had something serious to say. "That girl was eating 1 biscuit for breakfast and half a bowl at supper. I had to start putting the food directly in front of her and standing there until she ate it. Because if I left it out, she'd take the smallest portion and leave the rest for the hands." "Why?" "Because she thinks she doesn't have the right to eat her fill at someone else's table. That's why." Margaret picked up her coffee cup and pointed it at him. "You need to talk to her." "About what?" "Eating?" "About whatever happened to her before she got here." She set the cup down. "I've seen a lot of women come and go in my years, Samuel. Some of them were tired. Some of them were unlucky. But that girl, she's not tired. She's been hollowed out. There's a difference." Samuel said nothing. "She's been somewhere a long time where she learned to make herself small, to take up less space, to need less than she actually needs." Margaret looked at him. "And whoever taught her that did her real damage." He found her that evening on the back step, mending a pair of the ranch hand's work trousers by lamplight, because she had noticed they were fraying, and she had thought, without asking permission, that she would fix them. "Clara," he said. She looked up, waited. He sat down on the step beside her. There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. "You're not taking your full wage," he said. She looked at the trousers in her lap. "I didn't earn it all that week. Wednesday I was in the barn when I should have been." "You spent Wednesday keeping a calf alive that would have cost me 3 times your weekly wage if it had died," he said. "You earned every cent and then some." Clara threaded her needle through the cloth. "Pulled it through. I'm just doing what I'm here for." "Clara, who told you that you had to earn the right to be fed?" The needle stopped moving. She looked at her hands. "I'm not asking to be difficult," he said. "I'm asking because I'd like to understand what I'm working with." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "After my parents died, I went to live with my mother's cousins. There were 6 of them, and then there was me, and it was always made very clear that there were 7 mouths to feed but only 6 that had any right to expect to be fed." She started the needle moving again. "So I learned to take less, to work more, to make sure I was useful enough that they wouldn't think about how much it cost to keep me." Samuel looked at the side of her face. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel sorry for me," she said. "I'm telling you because you asked, and because you seem like the kind of man who asks questions he means." "I did mean it," he said. "I know." She bit the thread, examined her work. "It became a habit. That's all. Making yourself small enough that you don't inconvenience the people keeping you. You get good at it. After a while, you don't even notice you're doing it." "Take the full wage," he said. She looked at him. Something in her expression was complicated, not refusal. Not exactly, but something close to discomfort, the discomfort of someone being handed more than they know what to do with. "All right," she said. "And eat your full portion at every meal." She almost smiled. "Not quite. You're very specific for a man who doesn't say much." "I say what needs saying," he said. "Good night, Clara." He went inside. She sat on the step alone, in the dark, the mended trousers folded in her lap, the lamp burning low beside her. And she looked out at the mountains and thought something she had not thought in a very long time, something so strange and tentative that she could barely name it. She felt for the first time in years slightly less temporary. It was a Tuesday 3 weeks in, when she first saw the envelope. Samuel had left the morning correspondence on the kitchen table while she was clearing breakfast, a habit she'd noticed. The way he handled his mail before the day started, and she saw it without meaning to. The return address was Benson and Hale, attorneys at law, Billings, Montana. She didn't read anything more than that. She never did. Other people's business was their own. But Samuel was at the table still when she turned with a dishcloth in her hand. And she saw the way he was holding the envelope, not opening it. Just holding it. She said nothing, moved to the other side of the kitchen and began wiping down the counter. He didn't open it. After a long minute, he put it in the inside pocket of his coat, stood up, and went outside. That was when Holt Carver came through the back door, stamping mud off his boots, and he nearly walked into her. "Sorry, ma'am," he said, then stopped. "You see the boss's face just now?" "I didn't notice anything," she said. "Because it wasn't her business." Holt looked at the door Samuel had just gone through. "That's from the bank," he said, even though she hadn't asked. "Third one this month." Clara didn't say anything. Holt lowered his voice. "Carter Ranch has been struggling. 3 bad seasons in a row. Hailstorm took out the north pasture 2 years back. Then the creek flooded and took part of the fence line. And last year the cattle prices dropped so bad Samuel barely broke even." He looked at her. "He hasn't told the hands yet, but I do the books. We're behind on the mortgage by a lot." "That's Mr. Carter's private business," Clara said. "I know it is." Holt sat down at the table like he was tired all the way through. "I'm just telling you because you're here now, and because things might get worse before they get better, and I think you should know what you walked into." Clara put the dishcloth down on the counter. She looked at Holt Carver, a weathered, honest-faced man who clearly cared about this place, and the man who owned it, and she said, "How bad is behind?" Holt said, "Maybe 7 now. And a man came from Billings last week, asking questions about the water rights on the east parcel. Samuel didn't say anything about it, but I heard." He looked at his hands. "There are people who want this land, Miss Bennett. Have wanted it for a long time, and right now the ranch is vulnerable." Clara picked up the dishcloth again. She walked to the window and looked out at the yard, at the barn and the fence line and the mountains beyond. "Does he have anyone helping him with it?" she asked quietly. "Anyone who knows about these things?" "Samuel Carter doesn't ask for help," Holt said. "Never has." She stood at the window for a moment longer, and then she turned and went back to her work. That afternoon, she went into town. She told no one. She went on foot 3 miles down the road to the town of Grover, and she went directly to the county clerk's office on Main Street and asked to see the public records on the Carter land parcel. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers, looked at her a little oddly. But public records were public, and he pulled what she asked for. She sat at the reading table for 2 hours and went through every document. She came back to the ranch with mud on her boots and a very clear picture in her mind. What she found was not what she had expected. The mortgage itself was straightforward. But there was a second lien recorded against the east parcel, the water rights parcel that had been filed 14 months ago by a land company called the Harrow Development Company. And next to the signature on the filing was the name she would come to think of as the first real problem: Gerald Harrow. She said nothing to anyone that evening. She made supper. She went to bed, but she lay in the dark on the narrow cot in the storage room and stared at the ceiling and thought about a thing that Holt Carver had said. There are people who want this land. And she thought about the way Samuel had held that envelope and not opened it. And she thought about how a man who doesn't ask for help tends to go under quietly, and how quiet men going under don't usually come back up. She made a decision, without asking permission, without discussing it with anyone. She would find out exactly what Gerald Harrow had done, and exactly how he had done it. The next morning she woke at 3 and went to the kitchen and wrote a letter. She wrote it carefully, in the clean, clear handwriting that her mother had taught her, and that the relatives had tried to take away by keeping her too busy to practice. She addressed it to an attorney in Billings, not Benson and Hale, who represented the mortgage holder, but a different firm entirely. one whose name she had seen in the county records. A firm that had opposed Harrow Development Company in a filing 2 years prior. She folded the letter, sealed it, addressed it. When Samuel came down at 5, the kitchen was already lit, and the letter was already tucked inside her apron. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said. He poured his coffee. He sat down. She put a plate of eggs in front of him without being asked. He looked at her for a moment. She had the sense that he wanted to say something, and then thought better of it. She busied herself at the stove. "Clara," he said. "Hmm? Whatever you're doing, you don't have to." She turned around and looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup with the expression of a man who has said more than he meant to. "I don't know what you mean," she said, which was technically true, and also not true at all. "Yes, you do," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. "Eat your eggs, Mr. Carter," she said, and turned back to the stove. He ate his eggs. She mailed the letter that afternoon in town. 4 days later, a man arrived at Carter Ranch in a wagon. Not from Billings, not from any law firm. He was perhaps 50 years old, with silver hair and a good coat and the easy authority of a man who was accustomed to getting what he asked for. He said his name was Gerald Harrow. Samuel came out of the barn. Clara was hanging laundry on the line 20 yards away, and she did not move. "Mr. Carter," Harrow said, staying in the wagon, "I hope I'm not interrupting. I've come to talk to you about the East Parcel." "You sent a man last week," Samuel said. "I did. I understand you weren't available." The warmth in his voice was precise and professional. "I thought it might be more productive to speak directly. My company has a genuine interest in acquiring the water rights and the eastern acreage. We'd pay fairly, more than fairly given the current state of." He paused. "Rephrased, given the market. The land isn't for sale," Samuel said. "I understand that's your position today," Harrow smiled. "I'd ask you to reconsider, given your circumstances. We're prepared to move quickly and quietly, and I think you'd find the number I have in mind would solve certain problems that are currently." "The land isn't for sale," Samuel said again. Harrow looked at him for a long moment. The smile stayed on his face, but something behind it shifted. "I've found, Mr. Carter, that when a man is 6 months behind on his payments, his position on what is and isn't for sale tends to evolve." Samuel said nothing. "Think it over," Harrow said pleasantly. "I'll be in contact." He clicked his tongue at the horse, and the wagon began to move. Clara had not looked away from the laundry for the entire exchange. She had heard every word. When Harrow's wagon disappeared down the road, Samuel stood in the yard for a long moment, not moving. Then he went back into the barn. Clara finished hanging the laundry. She went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and wrote a second letter. This one to a different name she had found in the county records. A woman in Billings, a widow named Florence Dean, who had sold her property rights to Harrow Development Company 3 years ago under conditions that, when Clara had read the documents carefully, had looked very much like something other than a fair transaction. She addressed the letter, sealed it, and she sat for a moment at the table and thought about Samuel Carter, going back into his barn alone. And thought about what Holt had said: he doesn't ask for help. Never has. And she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not pity, not sympathy exactly, anger, quiet, careful, purposeful anger at a man in a good coat who knew exactly how much pressure it took to break someone who was already carrying too much, and used it without shame. She put the letter in her apron. She went back to work, but the anger stayed. That night, after supper, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Samuel had gone to his office, and the lamp under the door told her he was still working at the desk he'd been at every night since she arrived. She knocked. "Come in," he said. She opened the door and stood in the doorway. She didn't go in. She said, "I know about the second lien." The room went very still. Samuel was behind the desk. He had papers in front of him. She could see from the doorway that the papers were from the attorneys, from the bank, from the county, and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not anger, not surprise exactly. Something harder to name. "How?" he said. "I went to the county clerk's office," she said. The records are public. I found the Harrow filing, and I read it. And then I wrote a letter to an attorney I found in the opposing records. And I wrote another letter to a woman named Florence Dean who sold her property to Harrow 3 years ago, and I would have told you before I did either of those things. Except that I wasn't sure what your response would be, and I needed to move quickly before the information got old. She paused. I'm sorry if that was overstepping. He looked at her. I won't do anything else without telling you, she said. I saw what he was doing, and I knew you were in there alone, trying to figure it out. And I thought. She stopped. What did you think? He asked. His voice was not unkind. I thought that maybe this once. Someone should be on your side before you had to ask. The silence in the office was very complete. Samuel Carter sat very still. He was not, she realized, a man who was often surprised, but he looked surprised now. He looked like something had happened that he had not planned for. Sit down, he said. She came in, she sat. They talked for 2 hours. She laid out everything she had found. The lien, the timeline, the pattern of the Harrow filings across 3 other properties in the county over the past 5 years, all water rights, all distressed owners, all acquired at low prices after pressure that looked legal on the surface, but wasn't. She had brought her notes, written in her small, clear handwriting on folded paper she'd been keeping in her sewing basket. Samuel listened. He asked questions, sharp, specific questions that told her he understood what she was describing. He didn't argue. He didn't dismiss anything. He looked at her notes, and then he looked at her, and then he looked at the notes again. You did all this, he said. It was not quite a question. I had time, she said, which was not quite an answer. He looked at her for a long moment, and she felt the full weight of it, not unpleasant, but substantial, the weight of being seen clearly by someone who saw clearly. Clara, he said. Yes. Why? She thought about it honestly. Because you gave me a plate of eggs, she said, and a place to sleep. And you told me to eat my full portion and take my full wage. And nobody has told me either of those things in a very long time. And I thought, she looked at her hands, I thought maybe I could give you something back that was actually useful. He was quiet. Also, she said, Gerald Harrow has a good coat and a mean way of using information. And that kind of man has always made me angry. Something shifted in Samuel Carter's face. Quite a smile. Something smaller, warmer, and more real. You're very thorough, he said. I've had to be, she said. Mr. Carter Samuel. She looked up. He was watching her. If we're going to work on this together, he said, it should be Samuel. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, then I'll need your signature on a letter to the Billings attorney. I need it before end of the week if we're going to get ahead of whatever Harrow is planning next. He pulled the ledger across the desk. He picked up his pen. Tell me what to write, he said. Outside the window, the ranch was dark and cold and very quiet. Somewhere past the bunkhouse, Patch was barking once at nothing, as he sometimes did before settling. Clara Bennett sat across a desk from Samuel Carter and told him what to write. And for the first time in a very long time, she was not trying to make herself small. She took up exactly the space she needed, and she didn't apologize for it. The letter to the Billings attorney went out on a Friday. By Monday, Gerald Harrow had already sent someone new. Not a wagon this time. A rider alone who didn't come up to the house. He stopped at the fence line, looked at the property for a long while, and rode back the way he came. Holt Carver saw him from the north pasture and came straight to the kitchen to tell Clara, because somewhere in the past 2 weeks, without any formal declaration, she had become the person people brought information to. He wasn't carrying anything, Holt said. No papers. No bag, just looking at what? Clara asked. The east fence line. The water access point. Clara dried her hands on the kitchen towel and thought for 3 seconds. Don't tell Samuel yet. Let me check something first. Holt blinked. You sure about that? No, she said, but do it anyway. She went to her sewing basket. Inside, beneath the folded fabric and the spools of thread, was the small envelope she'd received 2 days ago from Florence Dean in Billings, the widow who had sold her property to Harrow 3 years prior. The letter inside was 2 pages handwritten, and what Florence Dean had written had kept Clara awake both nights since. She read the relevant section again. Florence Dean had not sold willingly. She had received a document, an amended survey. She had been told, filed with the county, that showed the creek running through her east pasture no longer met the legal threshold for private water rights. The survey had appeared from nowhere. She had no money for an attorney. She had sold for 60 cents on the letter to make the problem go away. Clara set the letter down and went to her notes. She had looked at the county survey records when she was at the clerk's office. She had not at the time been specifically looking for amended surveys. But she remembered seeing the index. She remembered a filing dated approximately 3 years back. "Holt," she said. He was still standing in the kitchen doorway. "Ma'am, I need to go to the county clerk's office again this afternoon. I need someone to drive the wagon." She paused. "I'd rather Samuel not know yet. Because if I'm wrong, I don't want to have worried him for nothing." Holt looked at her for a long moment. He was a careful man, loyal, and he clearly felt the pull between the woman standing in front of him and the man he'd worked for going on 9 years. "Ed can take you," he finally said. "I'll tell Samuel you went for supplies." "Tell him I went for supplies," she said. "Because I'll actually pick up the flour Margaret asked for, so it won't be a lie." Holt almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." The county clerk remembered her. He was less surprised to see her this time, which meant she was becoming a regular, which was fine. She asked for the amended survey records on file for the Grover County District. The 3-year window, eastern parcels. He pulled the files without comment. She sat at the reading table for 40 minutes. There it was. Filed 34 months ago, an amended survey for the Florence Dean property. The surveyor of record was a man named Cecil Galt out of Billings. She wrote the name down. Then she looked at the signature on the certification line. The official who had validated the amended survey's filing. The name was Deputy County Assessor Robert Finch. She wrote that down too. She sat very still for a moment, looking at both names. Then she pulled out her list of the other 3 properties she had identified in the pattern, the other distressed owners who had sold to Harrow Development Company over the past 5 years. She asked for those survey records as well. The clerk brought them. Cecil Galt, Robert Finch. Cecil Galt, Robert Finch. Every single one. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. This was not a land company taking advantage of desperate people. That would have been bad enough. This was a coordinated scheme, a surveyor who produced false documents, and a county official who certified them and made them legal, designed to strip water rights from landowners who had no way to fight back. And Carter Ranch's east parcel was next. She bought the flour. Ed drove her home without asking what she'd found. Because Ed Briggs was a man who knew when not to ask questions. She was grateful for him. She sat in the wagon with the flour sack on the seat beside her, and her notes pressed flat in her lap. And she watched the road go by, and she thought. By the time they pulled up to the ranch, she had decided 3 things. First, Samuel had to know everything. Tonight. Second, the attorney in Billings needed a second letter. Immediately. Third, she needed to find Cecil Galt before Harrow did. Because a surveyor who produced false documents was either a villain or a coward. And cowards, when properly motivated, talked. She told Samuel at the supper table, after the hands had cleared out. She set her notes in front of him and talked for 15 minutes straight. No hesitation, no softening. She told him about Florence Dean. She told him about the amended surveys. She told him the names. Galt, Finch. Samuel didn't move for a long moment after she finished. "The deputy assessor," he said. "Yes, Robert Finch." His voice was flat in a way that was different from his usual quiet. "I know Robert Finch. We went to the same church for 4 years." Clara said nothing. Samuel pushed back from the table. He stood up and walked to the window and put his hands on the sill and looked out at the dark. Clara watched the set of his shoulders. "He filed the same amended survey here," Samuel said. "Not quite a question." "Not yet," Clarissa said. "But the rider who came Monday was looking at the east fence line. The water access point. They're preparing to file." She paused. "We have a window. I don't know how wide. He turned around. His face was controlled, but his eyes weren't. What do we need to do? The attorney in Billings needs to know about Galt and Finch and all 4 properties. If he can get depositions from the other owners and pull the original survey records to compare against Galt's amended versions, it builds a pattern. A pattern is harder to dismiss than a single complaint. She folded her hands on the table. I also think someone needs to find Cecil Galt. Why? Because he's the weak link, she said. Harrow has money, and Finch has authority. Galt is just a man who made bad decisions and has been making them ever since. Probably because he's afraid to stop. A man like that, if you talk to him the right way, will tell you everything. Samuel looked at her. And who's going to talk to him the right way? I'll write the letter to the attorney tonight, she said. Which was not quite an answer to his question. I'll need you to sign it. He sat back down. He pulled the lamp closer. All right, he said. Let's write it. The response from Billings came faster than either of them expected. 8 days after they sent the second letter, a man arrived at Carter Ranch on horseback, not Jalrical Harrow's rider this time, but a lean, precise man in a traveling coat named James Ellery, who identified himself as an associate of the Billings firm, and who, before he even asked for water for his horse, said, Miss Bennett, your letter was exceptionally organized. We've been watching Harrow development for 14 months, and we hadn't put together what you put together in 2 weeks. Clara stood on the porch and said, Did you find Cecil Galt? Ellery paused. We know where he is. Is he willing to talk? Not yet, Ellery said. He's frightened. I'd like to speak with him, Clara said. Ellery looked at Samuel, who was standing just behind her shoulder. She's handling this, Samuel said. Ellery looked back at Clara. His expression shifted slightly from professional assessment to something closer to respect. He's in Harrowgate. That's 3 days' ride. I know where it is, Clara said. Can you arrange a meeting? There was a short silence. I can try, Ellery said. Try quickly, she said. Because if Harrow files the amended survey before we have Galt's statement, the window closes. Ellery went inside to speak with Samuel about the legal specifics. Clara stayed on the porch for a moment. Holt Carver appeared from around the corner of the house. He'd been close enough to hear. He looked at her with the expression he'd had since that first day in the kitchen, when she'd rearranged everything without moving a single thing. 3 days' ride, he said. I know. You've never been to Harrowgate. No, she said. Samuel's not going to like it. I know that too, she said. Go get the wagon schedule. I need to know when the next supply run goes north. Samuel didn't just not like it. He stood in the kitchen with his arms crossed and his jaw set and said, flatly, no. I'm not asking permission, Clara said, which was a sentence she had never said to anyone in her life before this moment, and which surprised both of them equally. He stared at her. Galt won't talk to an attorney, she said. Ellery said so himself. Galt is frightened. And frightened men don't talk to people in official positions because they're afraid of official consequences. But they talk to someone who has nothing to do with the law. She kept her voice even. I'm a woman with no legal authority and no threat to him. I'm someone who needs help. That's a very different conversation. You're talking about riding 3 days to sit down with a man who has been helping a criminal operation strip landowners of their property, Samuel said. You don't know what that man is capable of. I know exactly what that man is, Clara said. He's a coward who got in too deep and has been living with it ever since. That's not dangerous. That's desperate. And desperate people, when they see a way out that doesn't destroy them completely, will take it. And if he doesn't take it, then I come home and we fight it another way. She looked at him. Samuel, the ranch is at risk. You know that. I know that. Ellery knows that. The window is closing, and right now, the only move that might work before that amended survey gets filed is someone talking to Cecil Galt in the next 2 weeks. She paused. It should be me. He looked at her for a long time. Something moved across his face, something complicated, layered, the kind of expression that had more than one thing in it at once. I'll go with you, he said. The ranch can't lose you for 6 days. Ed and Holt can manage Samuel. She said his name the way he had said hers. A few weeks ago, on the back step. Quiet and direct. Let me do this. He was silent. Who told you that you had to solve everything alone, she said. And she saw, watching his face, that she had used his own words back at him, and that he recognized it, and that it landed somewhere it needed to land. He uncrossed his arms. He looked at the floor. He looked at her. Ed goes with you, he said. Not all right, she said. He's armed, all right. And you send word the minute you arrive, and the minute you leave. I will. He nodded once. Short and tight, the way a man nods when he's agreed to something he's not at peace with. Then he turned and went outside. And through the window she could see him standing in the yard, with his hands in his pockets, looking at nothing. Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway. Having heard the entire thing, because Margaret was always somewhere nearby when important things happened in that kitchen. Lord above, Margaret said quietly. Don't, Clara said. I'm not saying a word, Margaret said, and began making a very pointed amount of noise with the bread tins. They left on a Wednesday, Clara and Ed Briggs, with a wagon and a letter of introduction from James Ellery, and enough food for 4 days because Clara had packed it herself. Ed drove. Clara sat beside him with her notes and Florence Dean's letter and a list of questions she had been refining for 3 days. Ed was not a talkative man, which she appreciated. They went north in a companionable quiet, and on the first night they stopped at a house called Sims, and Clara ate a full supper and didn't apologize to anyone for it. It was, she realized, somewhere between the soup and the bread. The first meal she had eaten alone, truly alone, not in someone else's kitchen in longer than she could clearly remember. She slept well. On the second day, Ed finally spoke at length. He said, You know Samuel hasn't slept well since you left. Clara kept her eyes on the road ahead. He hasn't had time to be sleeping badly. I've only been gone 1 day. Holt sent word this morning. Samuel was up before 3. He's always up early. Miss Bennett, Ed said patiently. He saddled a horse at 4 in the morning and rode out to the north fence and back for no reason. That's not early rising. That's a man who needed something to do with himself. Clara said nothing. I'm not telling you that to make you feel a certain way, Ed said, in the tone of a man who was absolutely telling her that to make her feel a certain way. Drive the wagon, Ed, she said. He drove the wagon. Cecil Galt was not what she had pictured. She had pictured someone hard, someone with the look of a man who had made choices and owned them, even the bad ones. That was the face of a man who was difficult to reach. But Cecil Galt was 60-something, small, with a surveyor's careful hands and the eyes of a man who hadn't slept cleanly in 3 years. He came to the meeting. Ellery had arranged a back table at the boarding house in Harrogate, and he sat down and looked at Clara. And the first thing he said was, Are you from the law? No, she said. Government? No. Who are you? My name is Clara Bennett, she said. I work on Carter Ranch in Grover County. Harrow Development Company has been preparing to file an amended survey against the East Parcel. I believe you would be the surveyor of record on that filing. If it goes through. She set her hands flat on the table. Mr. Galt, I'm not here to threaten you. I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here because 4 families have already lost their water rights and their land, and another is about to, and you are the only person in a position to stop it. Galt looked at her hands on the table. He looked at her face. He looked at the door. Harrow told me it was legitimate, he said. His voice was almost inaudible. The first time. He said the original surveys were improperly filed and he needed corrected versions. I didn't, he stopped. I believed him. The first time. And after the first time? He looked at his own hands. He had the original documents, the ones I'd signed. He said if I didn't continue, he'd file a complaint with the assessor's office saying I had knowingly falsified the first survey. A pause. Which by then I had. Knowingly. Because I'd understood by the second property what he was actually doing. The table was very quiet. Mr. Galt, Clara said, I'm going to tell you something I know about coercion. Because I have been in situations where someone held something over me and used it to make me do things I didn't want to do. She waited until he looked at her. The only way out of that situation is to stop. Stop, admit what happened, and let the people who can actually fix it do so. Because the alternative is that you keep going, and one day it ends in a way that you have no control over. And at that point, the story is only about what you did. Not about how it started. Not about what he threatened. Just what you did. Galt was very still. The attorney in Billings can protect you, she said. Not entirely. There will be consequences, but they'll be smaller than the consequences of the alternative. She slid Ellery's letter across the table. He's already talking to the other property owners. They're not angry at you. They're angry at Harrow. But they need your statement to make it stick. He picked up the letter. He read it. He set it down. I have a wife, he said. 3 children, I know, she said. She did know. Ellery had told her. She had thought carefully about whether to use it and had decided against using it as leverage and in favor of simply being honest. Because leverage and honesty looked the port terms but felt different afterward, and she needed him to make a real decision. Not a pressured one. What happens to my license, he asked. I can't answer that with certainty, she said, but cooperating witnesses in criminal proceedings are treated differently than defendants. That's not a guarantee. It's a fact about how these things tend to go. He sat with the letter for a long time. Then he said, When does Harrow plan to file? Clara sat up slightly. You know, he told me to have the survey ready by the 15th, Galt said. That's 11 days. 11 days. She had 3 days back to the ranch. Ellery needed time to prepare. 11 days was not much. But it was something. Will you talk to Mr. Ellery, she asked. Galt folded the letter. He looked at it in his hands. He was quiet for so long that she thought he had made his decision, and it was the wrong one. She was already thinking about the next step, the harder path, the option that didn't include a cooperative witness. Then he said, Tell him to come in the morning. Clara let out a breath she had been holding for quite some time. Thank you, she said. He shook his head. Don't thank me. I should have done this a year ago. He stopped, tucking the letter into his coat. Missy paused. He knows about you. She went still. I'm sorry? Harrow. He knows someone at Carter Ranch has been asking questions at the county clerk's office. He knows someone wrote letters. Galt's voice was low and urgent. He doesn't know your name yet, but he has people watching. You should know that. She looked at him steadily. I appreciate you telling me. After he left, Ed Briggs appeared from the corner of the room, where he had been sitting quietly within earshot this entire time. He looked at her. We head back tonight, he said. No, she said. We head back at first light. I need to write to Ellery right now about the 15th. And I need you to take that letter to his office on the way out of town. And the part about Harrow knowing. Clara picked up her pen and smoothed a fresh piece of paper flat on the table. That part, she said, is for Samuel. She wrote quickly, in her small, clear handwriting, and didn't look up for the next hour. Outside, in the dark, in a town she didn't know, she wrote the words that might save a ranch that had never been hers. For a man who had once told her to eat her full portion, and meant it. And she did not think about what Harrow's people watching might mean for her specifically. She would think about that later. Right now there was work to do. When she finished, she sealed the letter for Ellery, folded her notes, and sat back in the chair. She thought about Samuel Carter saddling a horse at 4 a.m. for no reason. She thought about that for exactly as long as she would allow herself to think about it. Then she blew out the lamp and went to bed. She was back at Carter Ranch by Friday afternoon, 3 days after she'd left, and the first thing she noticed when the wagon pulled into the yard was that Samuel Carter was standing at the gate. Not working, not walking to the barn or coming from the house. Just standing at the gate, and when he saw the wagon, something in his posture changed, not dramatically. Not in a way that anyone who didn't watch people closely would catch. But Clara watched people closely. He stepped back to let the wagon through and said nothing. Ed climbed down and took the horse to the barn without being told. Clara climbed down with her bag and her notes and stood in front of Samuel and said, Galt will talk. He's meeting with Ellery in the morning. and Harrow plans to file the amended survey on the 15th. We have 11 days. Samuel looked at her face, then at the bag in her hand, then at her face again. Are you all right? He said. Yes. There's one more thing I need to tell you, but I'd rather do it inside. He took the bag from her hand without asking. She let him. They went inside. She told him about Harrow knowing, about the watching, about the fact that her name hadn't reached him yet, but might, and that the window they had was not just about the survey filing it, was about how much time at hand they had before Harrow understood exactly what was happening and moved to stop it directly. Samuel sat across the table from her and listened to all of it. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. He's going to come after you, Samuel said. He's going to try to come after the case, she said. That's different, Clara. If he comes after me specifically, it means the case is working. It means he's scared. She set her hands flat on the table. I'd rather he be scared of what I've found than comfortable. Scared men make mistakes. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. He said, I should have handled this myself. From the beginning. I let it get this far because he stopped. I didn't ask for help. I kept thinking I'd find a way through it alone, and I nearly let him win because of that. You asked for help the night I knocked on your office door, she said. You came to me. That's not the same as asking. It is, she said. When someone shows up at the right moment and you let them in. He looked at her. She looked back. 11 days, he said. 11 days, she agreed. They worked with a ferocity that surprised even Holt Carver, who had seen Samuel Carter work through blizzards and droughts, and a broken hand he'd wrapped himself and ignored for 3 weeks. Clara wrote to Florence Dean again, not asking for information this time, but asking if she would be willing to provide a sworn statement to Ellery's firm about the conditions of her sale. She wrote the same letter to the other 3 landowners, whose properties she had found in the county records. She was direct and she was honest. This is what we found. This is what it means. This is what helping would require of you. She did not promise outcomes she couldn't guarantee. She told them only that they were not alone and that someone was finally paying attention. 2 of them responded within 4 days. Florence Dean's letter came back first, 2 pages long, saying yes. The second owner, a man named Archie Pell, sent 4 lines that ended with, You are the first person who has contacted me about this matter in 3 years. I will say whatever needs saying. Samuel sent a rider to Billings with both letters the morning they arrived. On the 6th day, Ellery's associate, a younger man named Thomas Crane, who wore a coat slightly too large for him and had the alert, quiet efficiency of someone who had been underestimated his entire career, arrived at the ranch to review the full documentation Clara had assembled. He sat at the kitchen table with everything spread out in front of him and didn't speak for 40 minutes. Clara sat across from him and didn't rush him. Samuel stood near the window. Finally, Crane looked up and said, This is the cleanest private documentation of a fraudulent land scheme I have seen in 6 years of practice. Who put this together? She did, Samuel said from the window. Crane looked at Clara. You have no legal training? No, she said. Have you ever worked in a county assessor's office? A bank? Any administrative? No, she said. I worked in other people's houses. Crane was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with Golt's statement and the corroborating records from the other landowners, we have enough to bring a formal complaint before the district court. The question is whether we can file before the 15th. Can you? Clara asked. If we work through this weekend, Crane said yes. But I need Mr. Carter's authorization on 3 additional documents, and I need your notes on the Finch certification pattern, formally witnessed and signed. Tell me what to sign, Samuel said. Tell me where to sign, Clara said. Crane looked between the 2 of them, and then, very briefly, he smiled. It was the smile of a young man who had spent 6 years fighting things that felt unfightable and had just been handed ammunition. All right, he said, let's start. They worked through that Saturday and into the night. Margaret made coffee and food appeared at regular intervals, and nobody commented on the fact that this was how things worked at Carter Ranch, now that Clara and Samuel sat on the same side of a table and that the ranch ran around them the way water runs around two stones sitting close together in a stream. Holt Carver noticed. Ed Briggs noticed. Margaret noticed most of all. But she had decided some weeks ago, that she was not going to say anything about it because some things were better left to find their own shape without commentary. At 10 at night, Crane pushed back from the table and gathered his papers into order. "I'll write out first thing Monday," he said. "We'll file by Wednesday at the latest. That gives Harrow 3 days, maximum, before the court has the complaint on record. And once it's on record, any survey filing he makes will be flagged as a matter under judicial review." He looked at Clara. "You understand that once this is filed, Harrow will know who the source is." "He already suspects," she said. "Suspecting is different from knowing." "I know," she said. "I'm ready." Crane nodded, gathered his coat, and went to find the guest room Samuel had set up for him. The kitchen was quiet after he left. Margaret had gone home an hour earlier. The hands were long in the bunkhouse. It was just the two of them at the table, the lamp burning low between them, papers still spread around from the evening's work. Samuel reached across the table and picked up the notes Clara had written, the original ones. The ones from her first trip to the county clerk's office. In her small, clear handwriting, he looked at them for a moment. "I need to tell you something," he said. His voice had a different quality. Not the steady, factual tone he used for problems. Something underneath it, less comfortable with itself. Clara watched him. "When you went to Harrogate," he said, "I spent the first night telling myself it was the right call. That you were capable. That you knew what you were doing." He set the notes down. "And all of that was true. But he stopped. Samuel, I should have gone with you. Not because you needed protection. Because I should have been there." He looked at her. "I let you take the risk I should have shared, and I told myself it was because the ranch needed me here. And maybe that was partly true. But it was also easier to stay." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Easier how?" she said. He thought about that. "Easier than being in the same wagon as you for 6 days, he finally said. "And having to decide what to do about that." The kitchen was very still. Clara looked at the lamp, then at her hands, then at him. "We have 3 days before everything changes," she said. "Maybe we should decide what we're doing, with the things we're not saying, before this gets more complicated." He looked at her directly. "What are you not saying?" She had spent 26 years making herself smaller than her actual size. She had spent months at this ranch, slowly, carefully, cautiously taking up the space she actually occupied. And she thought about that now, about how long it had taken and how much it had cost. And she decided that she was tired of being cautious about this particular thing. "I'm not saying that somewhere between you telling me to eat my full portion and the two of us sitting in your office at midnight writing letters to attorneys. I stopped thinking of this as a job," she said. "I'm not saying that. Because I didn't know what to do with it." Samuel looked at her for a long time. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "The timing is—" "I'm not worried about the timing," he said. "There's Harrow and the lawsuit, and the court filing, and Clara." His voice was quiet and exact. "I know." She stopped. He reached across the papers and the lamp and the distance between their sides of the table, and he put his hand over hers. Not dramatic. Not a performance. Just a hand, placed with intention. On top of hers, she looked at it. She looked at him. "After the 15th, he said. "After the 15th, she agreed. He took his hand back. They both looked at the papers on the table for a moment. And then Clara picked up her pen, because there was still work to do. But something had settled between them, something that had been unsettled, since the back step, and the mending, and the office at midnight, and a man saddling a horse at 4 in the morning for no reason. Harrow moved on the 9th day. Not with a surveyor, not with a rider at the fence line. He came to the ranch himself, and this time he came with a man beside him. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the horses. She looked through the window and saw Harrow's wagon, and beside it, another horse carrying a man she recognized immediately. Robert Finch, Deputy County Assessor, the man whose signature appeared on every one of the fraudulent survey certifications. She moved fast. She went to Samuel's office, where he was going over the ranch ledgers with Holt. And she said, "Harrow is here." He brought Finch. Samuel stood up. "Let me come out with you," she said. "No," he said. "Samuel, I need you to do something more important." He picked up Crane's business card from the Crane had left for Billings that morning, 2 days ahead of schedule because the documents were ready, and he held it out to her. "Send a rider to Billings right now. Tell Crane that Harrow and Finch are both at the ranch today. He'll know what that means." She took the card. "What does it mean?" "It means Harrow knows about the filing. Or suspects it's coming. And if he's bringing Finch here personally, he's trying to do something before the complaint hits the court." He looked at her steadily. "The rider needs to leave in the next 5 minutes." She went. She found Ed Briggs in the barn and told him in 30 seconds what was needed. And Ed Briggs saddled a horse with the calm competence of a man who had been trusted with important things before. And he was through the back gate and on the north road within 4 minutes. Then she went back to the kitchen window. Samuel had come out onto the porch. Harrow was out of the wagon, standing in the yard with his good coat and his careful smile. Finch stayed on his horse. Clara could hear the voices through the window. Not every word, but enough. Harrow, warm and reasonable. Understand a complaint may be in preparation. Wanted to discuss it directly. Believe there may be some confusion about the survey records. Samuel. Flat and unhurried. "There's no confusion." Harrow. Still warm. "Someone on your ranch may have accessed county records under a misapprehension. The amended surveys are entirely legitimate, and I'd hate for an honest error to become a legal matter that benefits no one." A pause. Then Samuel said something she couldn't hear, and Harrow's smile shifted. Finch spoke from his horse, and his voice was different from Harrow's, tighter, less rehearsed. "Mr. Carter, the county assessor's office would take a very dim view of any filing that relies on improperly obtained or misrepresented records. If the source of those records is a private citizen with no authorization." "The records are public," Samuel said. "Anyone in the county can access them. The interpretation of those records is another matter," Finch said. "And if a person with no professional training was representing themselves as having legal authority to." "Nobody represented anything," Samuel said. "A woman read public documents and wrote down what she found. That's not a legal matter. That's reading." Clara pressed her lips together to keep from making a sound. Harrow tried once more, the warmth recalibrating, shifting to something more personal. "Samuel, we've lived in the same county for 12 years. Your wife and my wife used to speak at church. I don't want this to become adversarial. I'm offering a fair price for the east parcel, a generous price. This doesn't need to go before a court. It doesn't need to become a story that people in Grover tell for years." Samuel said, "The land isn't for sale. Get off my property." The warmth went out of Harrow's face entirely. What was underneath it was not angry, it was colder than anger. And more deliberate. He looked toward the house, directly at the window where Clara was standing. "She didn't move," Harrow said quietly. "The woman who's been asking questions." "She's here, she works here," Samuel said. "She should be careful," Harrow said. "People who insert themselves into business matters that don't concern them have a way of finding themselves in difficult positions." Samuel stepped down off the porch. He crossed the yard in 4 steps, and he stopped 1 foot from Gerald Harrow. And the height difference between them, Samuel was a tall man, and Harrow was not, became suddenly significantly relevant. "If you're threatening someone on my property," Samuel said, very quietly, "say it plainly. Say it so I understand exactly what you mean. And then get off my land." A silence. Harrow stepped back. He looked up at Samuel with the eyes of a man recalculating. He was a man who operated through legal mechanisms and financial pressure and the slow application of leverage. He was not a man who operated in the physical space of another man's anger. And Samuel Carter's stillness in that moment was more unsettling than any shouting would have been. "We'll be in touch through proper channels," Harrow said. And his voice had lost something. He turned and went to his wagon. Finch wheeled his horse. They left without another word. Samuel stood in the yard and watched until they were off the property. Then he turned and looked at the window. Clara stepped back from it. She went to the kitchen table and sat down and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed. Margaret, who had appeared from somewhere the way she always did, set a cup of tea in front of her, without a word. Samuel came inside 2 minutes later. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Fine," he said. Then, after a pause, he looked at you. "I know. Through the window. I know." I didn't move. She wrapped both hands around the teacup. He was trying to see if I was frightened. I didn't want to give him that. Samuel sat down across from her. He looked at her hands on the cup. "He's not going to stop," he said. "Even after the filing, he'll find another angle." "Probably," she said. "But every angle he tries after the filing is on the record. And men like Harrow are only comfortable when they can work in the dark." She looked up at him. "The filing puts a light on. That's what we need." He was quiet. Then he said, "He's going to figure out it was you who contacted the other landowners. He probably already knows. Clara." He said her name in a way that meant he wanted her to understand the weight of what he was saying, not to alarm her, but to be honest. "I need you to understand that I will not let anything happen to you. But I also need you to understand that I can't guarantee that Harrow won't try something before the court can stop him." She looked at him steadily. "I know that. Do you?" "Samuel," she said, "I have been in situations my entire life where someone had the power to make things difficult for me and used it. I know what that looks like. I'm not afraid of this. You should be a little afraid of it," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but not today." He looked at her for a moment. That direct, clear-eyed look that she had come to understand meant he was seeing exactly what was there and not what he wanted to see. "After the 15th, he said. "After the 15th, she said. The filing landed on the 13th day. 2 days late from Crane's original estimate, because one of the corroborating landowners had needed extra time to have his statement witnessed. But it arrived. Crane sent word by Ryder, and the word was, "Complaint formally filed with the District Court, Grover County, against Gerald Harrow and Harrow Development Company, with corroborating documentation, 4 witness statements, and the sworn testimony of Cecil Galt, licensed surveyor, detailing the full scope of the fraudulent survey scheme across 5 properties spanning 5 years. Robert Finch was named as a co-respondent. Holt Carver read the writer's message aloud at the kitchen table and then looked up. Ed Briggs had one hand over his mouth. Margaret was holding her coffee cup so tightly, her knuckles were pale. Clara sat at the table and felt something leave her body that had been sitting in her chest since Harrow had looked through the window at her. Not fear exactly. The vigilance that had been standing in for fear. The constant low-level attention she'd been paying to every sound and rider and piece of mail since Skolt had said, "He has people watching." It went out of her like a held breath. Slow and complete. "Well," Margaret said, and then she didn't say anything else because she had started to cry, which she did quietly and without any apparent embarrassment. Samuel was standing in the doorway. He had read the message first, alone before he'd brought it in. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him. "It's not over," he said. "No," she agreed. "Harrow will challenge it. Finch will hire an attorney. The court will take time." She set her hands on the table. "But the light is on." He nodded slowly. Then, because there were hands watching and Margaret was still quietly crying, and Holt was clearing his throat repeatedly in the way of a man suppressing a strong reaction. "Samuel," said Ed. "Holt, take the afternoon. Margaret, go home." He looked at Clara last. "Come outside." They went outside. Around the side of the house, away from the bunkhouse and the barn, where there was a stretch of fence that looked out toward the east pasture and the water access point that Harrow had wanted and was not going to get. Samuel leaned his arms on the top rail and looked out at the land. Clara stood beside him. "I owe you something," he said. "You don't owe me anything." "Yes, I do." He turned to face her. He had taken off his hat, which was something he rarely did outside. "When I hired you, I was looking for someone useful. Someone who could handle the work. And you have been. Far beyond anything I expected." He looked at her directly. "But somewhere around the 3rd week, I stopped thinking of you as someone useful and started." He stopped. Started again. You changed this place, Clara. Not the kitchen. Not the animals. The place. The feeling of it. I wake up in the morning and this is a different ranch than it was before you came. And that's not about cooking or mending. That's you. She looked at the fence post. She looked at the east pasture. She looked at him. Samuel, she said, I've been telling myself since I got here that I was only staying until I wasn't needed. That was the honest thing to say. That it protected us both. She paused. But I think I've been using it as a shield. Because if I said I was only temporary, then it didn't matter how much she stopped herself. How much you what? He said. She took a breath. How much I wanted to stay, she said. He was very still. Not because I have nowhere else, she said. Carefully, because that's not true anymore. I have Ellery's respect and Florence Dean's correspondence, and the knowledge that I can walk into a county clerk's office and read public records and write letters that actually change things. I have somewhere else now. I have options. She looked at him. I want to stay because this is where I want to be. That's different. And it matters to me that you know the difference. Samuel looked at her for a long time. The east pasture stretched behind him. The ranch was quiet and whole and still standing. Then stay, he said. Not a question, not a plea, just the simplest possible answer to the simplest possible truth. After the 15th, she said, and almost smiled. Clara, he said, with the patience of a man who had waited considerably longer than 2 weeks for things before, the 15th was 2 days ago. She looked at him. He was right. The filing was in. The 15th had passed. Something shifted in her face, and she let it shift. And she didn't look away. And in the quiet of the ranch on the afternoon, everything changed. Clara Bennett, who had spent her entire life making herself small and temporary, and careful not to want too much, stood at a fence post and allowed herself to want exactly what was right in front of her. The east pasture held the light. The water ran in the creek below. And Gerald Harrow, wherever he was that afternoon, had lost the thing he'd come to take. The court date was set for 6 weeks out. 6 weeks sounded like enough time. It wasn't. Crane wrote to say that Harrow's attorney, a man from Helena named Prescott, who had a reputation for making cases disappear before they reached a judge, had already filed 2 motions to delay the proceedings. The first challenged the admissibility of the county records, on grounds that they had been accessed and interpreted by a private citizen without professional authorization. The second challenged Galt's testimony on the basis that a man admitting criminal participation could not be a credible witness. Clara read both motions at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, Prescott is trying to cut the legs out from under the case before it walks into the courtroom. Samuel, across the table, said, Can he? The records us motion won't hold. Public records are public, any judge will throw that out. She set the pages down. The Galt motion is more dangerous. Prescott knows that without Galt's testimony, the pattern is harder to prove. He's not trying to win. He's trying to make the case thin enough that a cautious judge won't commit. What do we do? She thought for a moment. We need something that isn't Galt. Something that doesn't depend on a cooperating witness with a damaged reputation. She looked at the pages again. Florence Dean signed a statement. Archie Pell signed a statement. But statements about what happened to them individually aren't the same as proof of a coordinated scheme. She paused. We need the original surveys. Galt's real surveys, the ones he filed before Harrow got to him. If we can put those side by side with the amended versions and show a judge that the alterations were systematic and deliberate, that's not witness testimony. That's document evidence. Prescott can't touch document evidence with a credibility argument. Samuel said, Where are the original surveys? The county has the amended versions on record. But a licensed surveyor keeps copies of everything he files. She looked at him. Galt has them. Or he did. Crane needs to ask him directly. Crane already has Galt's cooperation. Crane has Galt's statement. That's different from Galt handing over physical copies of documents that prove he was complicit from the beginning. She put her hands flat on the table. Someone needs to ask him. In person. Carefully. Samuel looked at her. You want to go back, Crane should go, she said. He has the legal authority to receive them properly. But I think a letter from me, explaining what we're asking for, and why it matters to Galt specifically to provide them, would help Crane's chances. She met his eyes. Galt trusts me. Or he trusts me as much as he trusts anyone right now. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Write the letter, he said. She had already pulled out the paper. She wrote to Galt that afternoon. She didn't dress it up. She told him plainly what Prescott was doing, what it meant for the other landowners, and what providing the original surveys would cost him versus what it would give him. She told him that a man who could prove he had kept accurate records who had, in other words, documented the truth even while he was forced to falsify the official versions, was a different kind of man than Prescott was trying to paint him as. She told him the original surveys were the difference between a witness and proof. Then she added one more paragraph at the end that she almost crossed out, but didn't. She wrote, I know you are afraid. I know this has cost you sleep, and I know it will cost you more before it's done. But there are 5 families who lost something real, and another who almost did, and the man responsible has a lawyer who is very good at making the people who were hurt seem like the problem. You are the only person who can make that impossible. I believe you will do the right thing, not because it is easy, but because you are not, in the end, the person Harrow made you into. She sent it with Crane's follow-up instructions. Then she waited. The waiting was its own kind of hard. The ranch ran. The work continued. Cattle moved, fences held. The kitchen turned out 3 meals a day. Clara mended and cooked and organized and tended the animals. And she and Samuel spoke every evening about the case, going over what they knew and what they were still waiting for. And somewhere in those evening conversations a new shape had formed between them, not the cautious, careful distance of the early weeks, but something easier and more honest. The shape of 2 people who had decided to occupy the same territory without apology. Holt Carver noticed and said nothing. Ed Briggs noticed and said nothing. Margaret noticed and said things constantly, none of them directly about what she was noticing. On the 8th day of waiting, a woman arrived. She came on horseback, alone, and she was perhaps 60 years old with a straight spine and a face that had been weathered into something handsome. She tied her horse at the post and knocked at the ranch door, and when Clara opened it, the woman said, I'm looking for Clara Bennett. That's me, Clara said. My name is Ida Pell, Archie's wife. He told me what you did, what you're doing. She paused. I came to help. Clara stepped back and let her in. Ida Pell sat at the kitchen table and said, without preamble, that she had something the lawyers didn't know about. 3 years ago, when Harrow had first approached her husband about the survey irregularities on their property, she had written everything down, every conversation, every visit, every document Harrow had presented, and every date it had appeared. She had kept the record in a locked box in her bedroom because she had learned, growing up with a father who was a farmer and a mother who kept meticulous household accounts, that when powerful men came with papers, the only weapon ordinary people had was their own written record. Clara looked at the small journal Ida Pell set on the table. This documents everything, Ida said. Dates, names. What was said. What was shown to us. How long they gave us before the first payment demand. Her voice was steady and dry. I kept it because I thought someday someone would want to know. I just didn't know who or when. Clara put her hand on the journal and then looked up at Ida Pell. Mrs. Pell, she said, I need to ask you something. And I need you to answer honestly. Go ahead. Why did you wait 3 years? Ida Pell looked at her for a moment. Then she said, because for 3 years, nobody asked. Crane came back from Harrogate on a Friday with Cecil Galt's original survey copies, tucked in a leather case, and an expression on his face that Clara had not seen before, bright-eyed and slightly disbelieving. The look of a man who had been handed more than he expected. He spread the original surveys on the kitchen table, next to the amended versions. The differences were not subtle. They were not the minor adjustments of legitimate correction. They were the deliberate, systematic alteration of measurement data. boundary markers and elevation records specific technical falsifications that, placed next to the originals, told a story a judge could follow without legal training. This, Crane said, tapping the comparison, is the case. This is what we put in front of the judge, and Prescott has no motion that touches it. Because this is not testimony. It is not interpretation. It is two sets of documents with the same surveyor's name on them, and they tell two completely different stories of the same piece of land. When can you file the supplemental documentation? Clara asked. This week, Crane said, and Miss Bennett, he stopped. I want to be very direct with you. When this goes before the judge, Prescott is going to argue that the chain of discovery is improper. He's going to point to you specifically. He's going to say that a woman with no legal standing inserted herself into a matter she had no business in and contaminated the evidence trail. Clara looked at him. And what does the judge do with that? Depends on the judge, Crane said. But I want you to be prepared for the possibility that your name is going to be spoken in that courtroom in a way that is not flattering. I'm prepared, she said. It may affect your reputation in this county, Mr. Crane, she said. My reputation in this county is currently that of the woman who works at Carter Ranch. I don't have much to protect, and I'm not particularly worried about it. She pulled Ida Pell's journal from the stack of documents and slid it across the table to him. Add this to the supplemental filing. It corroborates everything Galt's original surveys show, from the perspective of one of the affected landowners, with dates and specific details that match our timeline exactly. Crane opened the journal. He read for a full minute without looking up. Then he said, "Where did this come from?" "A woman who kept records because she learned it mattered," Clara said. Crane looked at her. He looked at the journal. He looked at Samuel, who was standing near the window. "All right," he said. "This is going to work." 2 days before the court date, everything came apart. Clara was in the barn with Patch early in the morning when Holt came in fast, which was not something Holt Carver did. He moved carefully as a matter of principle. When he came through the barn door at speed, her stomach dropped. "Ryder just came from town," he said. Crane sent word. "Galt is gone." She straightened up. "Gone where? Nobody knows. He left Harrogate sometime in the last 2 days. His wife says he didn't tell her where. His office is locked." Holt looked at her. "Crane thinks Harrow got to him." She stood in the barn for a moment, very still, and thought. Galt was scared. She had known Galt was scared. But she had believed she had written to him about choosing the right thing, about not being the person Harrow had made him into, and she had believed he had chosen. She had believed it because she needed to believe it. And that, she now understood, was the first mistake she had made in all of this. She had wanted Galt to be a certain kind of person, badly enough, that she'd stopped accounting for the possibility that he wasn't. "Does Crane still have the original surveys?" she said. "Yes. He has everything. But without Galt to testify to their authenticity. They're still documents," she said. "They still exist. Prescott can challenge their source, but he can't make them not exist." She was already moving toward the door. "Get Samuel. I need to talk to him." Holt went. She came out of the barn and went straight to the kitchen and stood at the table and worked through it quickly, moving the pieces in her mind. Galt's testimony was gone. That was real. But the surveys were real. Ida Pell's journal was real. Florence Dean's statement and Archie Pell's statement were real. The pattern across 5 properties was documented and corroborated by people who had nothing to gain from lying and everything to gain from telling the truth. What she needed now was someone who could speak to the survey's authenticity without Galt. A licensed surveyor who could look at the original measurements and tell a judge that these numbers were internally consistent and accurate, that the amended versions showed mathematically impossible alterations. She needed an expert. Samuel came in. She told him in 30 seconds what she was thinking. He said, "I know a surveyor in Billings. Retired. His name is George Arnett. He was the most respected surveyor in this territory for 20 years. He paused. He's not going to want to get involved in a legal case. Will he talk to me?" she said. "I don't know. Will he talk to you?" Samuel thought about it. Maybe. We worked adjacent properties once years back. He's an honest man, if I go to him directly and explain. Can you leave today? She said. He looked at her. Yes, go, she said. Crane needs to know there's a supplemental witness being identified. Tell him to ask the judge for a 3-day extension before the hearing. Prescott has filed 2 motions for delay already. Crane is owed at least 1. What are you doing while I'm gone? Samuel said. She was already pulling out paper, writing to the other landowners. If Galt disappeared because Harrow pressured him, I need Florence Dean and Archie Pell to know that their testimony is now the backbone of this case. And I need them to not disappear too. Samuel put on his coat. He picked up his hat. He stopped at the kitchen door and looked at her. Clara, he said. Go, she said, not unkindly. Come back with Arnett. He went. She wrote 4 letters in 2 hours to Florence Dean, to Archie Pell, to Ida Pell, and to a 4th property owner she had identified early in her research, but hadn't yet contacted because the case had seemed strong enough without him. His name was Roy Sutton, and he had sold his water rights to Harrow 4 years ago, and, according to the county records, had filed a complaint with the county assessor's office 2 months later that had been dismissed without investigation by Robert Finch. She wrote to Sutton not with the careful, measured language she had used before, but plainly. She told him what was happening. She told him that Finch was named in the complaint. She told him that his dismissed complaint was already in the court record, and that a judge was going to see it, whether he participated or not. But that if he came forward now, it would mean something different than if he didn't. She told him she understood if he was frightened. She told him it was all right to be frightened, and that this had gone on long enough. She sent all 4 letters. Then she sat in the kitchen for a long moment in the quiet of a house where Samuel wasn't. And she let herself feel the weight of Galt's disappearance. Not just strategically, personally. She had believed in him and she had been wrong. And she needed to sit with that for a few minutes before she could put it down and move on. Patch pressed his head against her knee from under the table. She put her hand on his head. 3 minutes. Then she stood up and went back to work. Samuel came back on the 3rd day with George Arnett. Arnett was 70 years old, compact, with sharp eyes and the hands of a man who had spent 50 years with measuring instruments. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at Galt's original surveys side by side, with the amended versions for 20 minutes without speaking. Clara sat across from him and said nothing. Samuel stood near the door. Finally, Arnett looked up and said, "These alterations are not professional errors. They are deliberate falsifications. The changes to the elevation markers alone are technically impossible to explain. As corrections, you can't remeasure a water elevation and get these numbers unless you're measuring a different body of water entirely, or you're making them up." He tapped the amended survey with one finger. No licensed surveyor would sign this as a legitimate correction unless they were lying. And I would say that to a judge. Will you? Clara said. Arnett looked at her. Who are you? Clara Bennett. I work on Carter Ranch. You put this case together? Most of it, she said. He looked at the surveys again, then at her. Yes, he said. I'll say it to a judge, she exhaled slowly. Thank you. He shook his head. I knew the surveyors of record on 2 of these properties personally. Decent men. Honest work. If their land records were being falsified under their names, I want the person who did that held accountable. He gathered the documents into a careful stack. I'll need to prepare a formal analysis. Can your attorney receive it by Friday? I'll make sure of it, she said. Roy Sutton arrived on a Wednesday. He was younger than she'd expected, 40, maybe, with the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. He came alone, on horseback, and he came all the way from his current property in the next county, because, as he told Clara when she brought him into the kitchen, he had read her letter 4 times and slept badly for 3 nights, and then saddled his horse. Finch dismissed my complaint, he said, sitting at the table with his hat in his hands. I filed it within 60 days of the sale. I knew something was wrong. The survey numbers didn't match what I'd been told when I bought the property. He looked at his hat. Finch told me the complaint was outside his jurisdiction, and there was nothing the county could do. He sent me a letter. I kept it. Clara went very still. You have the letter, she said. I have the letter, he said. He reached into his coat and put it on the table. It was folded and refolded many times. The creases worn soft, the kind of document a man takes out and looks at periodically to remind himself of something he hasn't resolved. Clara unfolded it carefully and read it. It was brief, official, signed by Robert Finch, and it contained a sentence that made her hold her breath. This office has reviewed the survey records in question and found no irregularity warranting further review. Finch had reviewed the records. Finch had certified the amended survey. Finch had then dismissed a complaint about that same survey, with a letter claiming to have reviewed the records and found no irregularity. Finch had reviewed his own fraud and declared it clean. Mr. Sutton, she said, I need you to know that this letter is going to be the most important document in this case. He looked up. More than the surveys. The surveys prove the fraud happened. This letter proves Finch knew and participated in the cover-up. That's two separate crimes and two separate defendants. And one letter connects them both. She put her hand flat on the table next to it. Will you give this to our attorney? That's why I came, he said. She called it the night before the hearing. Not deliberately. She didn't go to Samuel's office to make an announcement. She came downstairs after midnight because she couldn't sleep, and he was already in the kitchen, which she should have expected. They had both developed the habit of early hours and late nights, and the kitchen was where they both ended up when there was too much to sit still with. He had coffee on. She sat down. He poured her a cup without asking. We have everything, she said. I know, he said. Arnett's analysis, Sutton's letter, Ida Pell's journal, 2 sworn statements, the original surveys. She turned the cup in her hand. Even without Galt, it's there. I know, he said. She looked at him. You should have slept, so should you, he said. They sat with that for a moment. Samuel, she said. Whatever happens tomorrow, if Prescott finds a way to delay again, or if the judge decides, he won't, but if he does, Clara, he said her name the way he always said it when he wanted her to stop and listen. Whatever happens tomorrow, you built something here that didn't exist before you came. Not just the case, the way this ranch runs now, the way the hands talk about their work, the way Patch follows you everywhere and has stopped trying to bite Holt. He paused. The way I don't dread coming inside at the end of the day. She looked at him. You changed what this place feels like, he said. That's not the legal case. That's something else entirely. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Samuel, before this is over, I need to tell you something. He waited. When I first came here, I told you I would leave as soon as I wasn't needed. And I meant it. I had said that same thing to everyone I'd ever worked for. And I meant it every time. But here's what I didn't understand then. She put both hands around her coffee cup. I kept waiting to not be needed. I kept waiting for the moment where it was clear I was surplus, where the work would be done and there would be nothing left for me to do. And that moment never came. And at first I thought it was because the ranch needed a lot of work. She looked at him. Then I realized it was because you kept making room. Every time I thought I'd reached the edge of what was mine here, you made more room. Samuel was very still. You never once asked me to make myself smaller, she said. Not once. And I've been thinking about what that means for weeks. She set down the cup. It means I want to stop waiting for the moment when I'm not needed. Because I think I finally understand that's not how this works. That's not what this is, no, he said quietly. It's not. I want to stay, she said. Not because I have nowhere to go. Not because the case needs finishing or the ranch needs managing. Because this is where I am when I'm most myself. She met his eyes. And I wanted to say that before tomorrow, in case tomorrow is loud and difficult and there's no room for it. Samuel set down his coffee cup. He reached across the table and took her hand, and this time it was not the careful, momentary gesture from weeks ago. This time he held it. I have been a man who doesn't ask for things, he said. My whole life. Whatever I needed, I told myself I'd work until I had it or go without. I didn't ask. He looked at their hands. I'm asking now. I'm asking you to stay. Not as someone who works here. As someone he stopped. Tried again. As someone this is all for. The kitchen held the quiet of a house that had been empty for a long time and wasn't anymore. All right, Clara said. It was the simplest answer she had ever given. And she meant it more completely than she had ever meant anything. Outside, Pat shifted against the door, resettled, and went back to sleep. Tomorrow was the court. Tonight was theirs. The courthouse in Grover was the oldest building on Main Street. And on the morning of the hearing, it was full in a way it had not been full in years. Clara noticed that first not the building, but the people. Florence Dean had come from Billings, a woman in her 60s with careful eyes and good posture, who had traveled 2 days to sit in a courtroom and watch something happen that she had stopped believing would ever happen. Archie and Ida Pell sat 3 rows back. Ida with her hands folded in her lap with the stillness of a woman who had been patient for a very long time. Roy Sutton sat on the end of a bench near the window, hat in his hands, looking at the floor the way he had looked at it in Clara's kitchen, like a man who had carried something heavy for so long that putting it down felt foreign. There were others Clara didn't know, neighbors of the affected landowners, by the look of them, people from the county who had heard something was happening and had come to see, a woman from the local paper with a small notebook, people who knew Gerald Harrow and had their own feelings about knowing him. The room was full, and it was full with intention. Clara sat beside Crane at the front table. Samuel sat directly behind her. She felt him there without turning around, that particular stillness that was distinctly his, the way he took up space without announcing it. Across the aisle, Prescott was already arranging his papers with the focused efficiency of a man who had won in rooms like this before and expected to do it again. Harrow sat beside him in a coat even finer than the one he'd worn to the ranch. And next to Harrow, Robert Finch, who had not looked at anyone since he came in, and who was looking at the table now. Finch looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. Good, Clara thought, and then was mildly surprised by herself. Judge Warren Hale was 63 years old, had presided over Grover County District Court for 19 years, and had a reputation for 2 things: patience with complicated evidence and no patience whatsoever for legal maneuvering that wasted his time. He came in without ceremony, sat, looked at the room, and said, "We have a full house. I trust everyone understands this is a court proceeding and will conduct themselves accordingly." He looked at both tables. "Mr. Crane, Mr. Prescott, are we ready?" Crane said yes. Prescott stood immediately. "Your Honor, before we begin, the defense would like to renew its motion to sit down." "Mr. Prescott," Judge Hale said, "your motions have been reviewed. We are proceeding. Sit down." Prescott sat. Clara kept her face still. Crane presented the case methodically, the way he and Clara had mapped it out across 3 evenings at the kitchen table. He started with the pattern: 5 properties, 5 amended surveys, 5 sales to Harrow Development Company at prices between 40 and 70% below assessed value. He put the original surveys on record, authenticated by George Arnett's expert analysis, and he walked the judge through the specific technical falsifications in language that was precise without being impenetrable. He presented Florence Dean's statement, Archie Pell's statement, Roy Sutton's statement. He presented Ida Pell's journal, dated and specific. He presented Robert Finch's letter to Sutton, the letter in which Finch had certified the amended survey as accurate and then dismissed Sutton's subsequent complaint by claiming to have found no irregularity in the same records. He put it all in front of the judge in order, cleanly, without drama. Then he said, "Your Honor, the complaint asks the court to find that Gerald Harrow and Harrow Development Company engaged in a systematic scheme of document fraud and coercion, and that Deputy County Assessor Robert Finch knowingly participated in that scheme by certifying falsified documents and suppressing legitimate complaints. The relief sought is the nullification of all 5 property sales, restitution to the affected landowners, and referral of both defendants to the district attorney for criminal prosecution." The room was very quiet after he finished. Prescott's turn came and he was good. Clara gave him that. He was controlled and methodical, and he knew exactly where the case's weak points were. He pressed hard on Galt's absence, if the surveyor himself was not present, to authenticate the original documents. The chain of custody was imperfect. He pressed on the expert analysis. George Arnett had not personally surveyed any of the affected properties, and was therefore offering an opinion, not a fact. He characterized the landowner's statements as the understandable but subjective accounts of people who had made poor financial decisions and were now looking for someone to blame. He did not mention Clara by name, but he said an unqualified private individual 3 times in 10 minutes. And the third time he said it, something shifted in the room. Clara felt it not in the judge, who remained entirely unreadable, but in the people behind her. A small sound, not quite a word, from somewhere in the middle rows. She did not turn around. Prescott's real move came after the noon recess. He stood and said, "Your Honor, the defense would like to call one witness." Crane leaned toward Clara and said, very quietly, "We didn't know about a witness." "Neither did I," she murmured. The witness was a man named Harold Voss, and he was a county land agent who had worked adjacent to Finch's office for 6 years. Prescott walked him through a series of questions designed to establish that the surveying process in Grover County involved multiple layers of review and that no single official meaning Finch could have unilaterally certified a fraudulent document without others noticing. It was careful testimony. It was intended to create reasonable doubt around Finch's specific culpability. And then Crane stood up for cross-examination. He asked Harold Voss 3 questions. The first, who was responsible for final certification of amended survey filings? Voss said the deputy assessor. The second, was that certification process subject to independent review? Voss said no, it was the deputy assessor's sole authority. The third, had Harold Voss ever personally reviewed any of the 5 surveys in question? Voss hesitated. "Mr. Voss," Crane said, "had you personally reviewed any of the 5 amended surveys at the center of this complaint at any time before today?" "No," Voss said. "Thank you," Crane said, and sat down. Clara exhaled through her nose. Across the aisle, she heard Prescott say something quiet and sharp to Harrow, and Harrow's jaw tightened. What happened next was the thing Clara had not anticipated, and it changed everything. Judge Hale called a brief recess. When he returned, he did not sit. He stood at the front of the courtroom, which was unusual enough that the room went completely silent before he spoke. "I have reviewed the supplemental documentation submitted by the plaintiff's counsel," he said, "including the expert survey analysis provided by Mr. George Arnett, and I have a question for the defense." He looked at Prescott. "Mr. Prescott, your client Gerald Harrow's company filed a preliminary survey notice against a 6th property 3 months ago. The Carter Ranch East Parcel, Grover County." Prescott said carefully that notice was a preliminary inquiry. "Your Honor, not a formal. The notice is in the county record," Judge Hale said. "The surveyor named on the preliminary notice is Cecil Galt, who has provided sworn testimony as part of this proceeding." He paused. "I want to understand why a surveyor who was, at the time of that filing, already under investigation, whether your client knew that or not, was named on a preliminary notice for a 6th property. I want that explained to me." Prescott started to answer, and then the back door of the courtroom opened. Clara heard it, everyone heard it, and she turned, which she had told herself she wouldn't do. Cecil Galt was standing at the back of the courtroom. He was thinner than she remembered. His coat was the same one he'd worn to the boarding house in Harrogate. But he'd shaved, and his hair was combed, and he was standing very straight in a way that looked like it was costing him something. He walked to the front of the courtroom. He stopped at the bar. He looked at Judge Hale and said, "I'm Cecil Galt. I understand I'm named in this proceeding. I'd like to speak, if the court will allow it." The courtroom erupted. Judge Hale brought his gavel down once hard, and the room went quiet. He looked at Galt for a long moment, then he looked at Crane. "Is this your witness, counselor?" "Your Honor," Crane said, with the composure of a man who was stunned and knew better than to show it. "Mr. Galt provided a sworn statement to our firm, which is already in the record." His presence here was unanticipated. Hale looked at Galt. "Mr. Galt, you understand you are under no obligation to testify. You also understand that anything you say in this courtroom is on the record and may be used in subsequent proceeding." "Yes, sir," Galt said. "Prescott, objections?" Prescott was conferring rapidly with Harrow. He stood. "The defense objects on the grounds that this witness was not disclosed." "He's already in the record," Hale said. "Sworn statement, filed by plaintiff's counsel 2 weeks ago." "Objection overruled. Mr. Galt, take a seat." Galt took the stand and told the truth. All of it. From the beginning. The first survey he'd falsified, because Harrow had told him it was a legitimate correction. The moment he had understood it wasn't. The coercion Harrow holding the original documents. Threatening a complaint to the assessor's office. The second property. The third, the conversation with Finch, in which Finch had made it clear that the certifications would go through, and that Galt should not worry about the process. Because the process was handled. He said that phrase twice. And each time he said it, Clara could feel the room absorb it. The process was handled. Finch had used those words. The process was handled. He talked for 40 minutes. His voice shook at the beginning and steadied in the middle, and was very quiet at the end. But it never stopped. When he finished, Prescott cross-examined him for 20 minutes, pressing hard on his credibility, on his admitted falsifications, on the months he had spent not coming forward. Galt answered every question without deflecting. He said, more than once, "You're right. That was wrong. I should have come forward sooner. I didn't. I'm here now." It was not the answer of a man performing remorse. It was the answer of a man who had run out of ways to avoid himself. When Prescott finished, Clara felt Samuel's hand briefly on her shoulder from the bench behind 1 second. No pressure, just contact and then gone. She put her hand over the place it had been for a moment, then put both hands flat on the table. Judge Hale did not take long. He recessed for 90 minutes, returned, and delivered his findings in the measured, precise language of a man who had been thinking about exactly how to say each sentence for the full 90 minutes. He found on the preponderance of the evidence that Gerald Harrow and Harrow Development Company had engaged in a systematic and deliberate scheme of document fraud against 5 landowners in Grover County over a period of 5 years. He found that Robert Finch, in his capacity as deputy county assessor, had knowingly certified fraudulent documents and had suppressed legitimate complaints by at least one affected landowner, thereby using his official position to facilitate the scheme. He ordered the nullification of all 5 property transactions and the return of the properties to their original owners, or fair restitution where return was no longer possible. He ordered the immediate suspension of Robert Finch, pending a criminal referral to the district attorney. He referred both Harrow and Finch to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. He then looked up from his notes and said, "The court is also noting, for the record, that the documentation assembled in this case reflects an unusual degree of thoroughness and accuracy. The survey analysis, the corroborating personal records, and the pattern identification across 5 properties represent work that most legal teams would have taken months to compile. I don't know who put it together." He paused. "But it was done right." Clara looked at the table. Behind her, she heard Ida Pell make a sound that was not quite a word. She heard Archie Pell clear his throat. She heard Florence Dean say something quiet to the person beside her. She did not cry. She had known somewhere in the last hour that she was not going to cry because the feeling in her chest was not grief, and it was not relief exactly. It was something older and quieter than either of those things. It was the feeling of something that was wrong being made right. And it was heavier and more serious than happiness. Harrow stood when the judge finished. He stood the way a man stands when he is trying to maintain a posture that no longer has anything to hold it up. He looked at his attorney. He looked at Finch, who had not raised his head. He looked at the room at Florence Dean, who looked back at him steadily. At Roy Sutton, who also looked back. At Ida Pell, who did not look at him at all. Which was somehow worse. He looked, finally, toward Clara. She met his eyes and held them. She did not speak. She did not need to. He looked away first. His attorney touched his arm, and they moved toward the door. And the room parted for them with the particular silence of people who have decided someone does not deserve their words. Finch went out separately, with a deputy beside him, and he kept his eyes on the floor the entire way. The courtroom took several minutes to settle into something other than a proceeding. Florence Dean crossed to where Clara was standing and took both her hands in hers and said nothing. Just held them for a moment, and Clara let her. Archie Pell shook Crane's hand and then turned and shook Clara's with the same firmness, as if the distinction didn't occur to him, which she appreciated. Roy Sutton came to stand nearby and said, "I've had that letter in my coat for 3 years." And she said, "I know." And he said, "I should have done something sooner." And she said, "You're here now." And he nodded like a man accepting something. Ida Pell was the last. She waited until the others had spoken, and then she stood in front of Clara and said simply, "My husband cried this morning before we came. He didn't know I saw. He's not a man who cries." Clara looked at her. "Thank you," Ida said, "for asking, for being someone worth answering." George Arnett appeared at her elbow after the Pells had gone, his survey case under one arm, and said, "Fine work, Miss Bennett," with the directness of a man who did not distribute compliments casually. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thanks Sutton's letter," he said. "That's what made it airtight." "Sutton came because someone asked," she said. Arnett looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I suppose that's the whole of it." He left. Crane appeared at her side, papers tucked under his arm, looking like a man who had just run a long race and wasn't quite sure his legs were working. "The district attorney's office will be in contact within the week," he said. "Criminal proceedings will take time, months, possibly longer. But the civil judgment stands immediately. The properties are restored." He paused. "And Finch is done." "The other properties," she said. "The restitution will Florence Dean actually see it?" "The court ordered it," he said. "Harrow has assets. His attorneys will try to move them, but we flagged that risk in the filing. The judge is aware." He looked at her directly. "You thought of that in the original documentation." "I thought about it," she said. "I wasn't sure it would be enough." "It was," he said. He shook her hand formally, which made her almost smile. And then he went to find Samuel. She found Samuel outside. He was standing at the bottom of the courthouse steps, hat in his hand, talking to Ed Briggs, who had driven them into town that morning and had spent the entire hearing outside because, as he'd explained, he didn't hold with courtrooms, but he did hold with being nearby in case he was needed. Samuel looked up when she came out. She walked down the steps and stopped in front of him. "Well," Ed said. "The judge found for us," she said. "All 5 properties restored. Finch suspended and referred for criminal prosecution. Harrow as well." Ed Briggs took off his hat, looked at the sky, and put his hat back on. It was the most expressive she had ever seen him. Samuel looked at her face. "And you?" he said, which was not what she'd expected him to ask. She started to say fine, the way she always said fine. The way she had said fine for 26 years, as a default answer to any question about her condition, and then she stopped. "I'm glad it's over," she said instead. "And I'm tired. And I'm glad expect that." "I know," Samuel said. He didn't have to. He'd already given his statement. He came because she thought about her letter, about what she'd written, about not being the person Harrow made you into. He came because he decided to. "Like someone else I know," Samuel said. Ed Briggs made a sound that might have been a cough and walked away toward the wagon with great purpose. Clara looked at Samuel. "I want to go home," she said. It was the first time she had said that word about Carter Ranch. Not the ranch. Not back. Home. Samuel heard it. She saw him hear it. "Let's go home," he said. 3 months later. Carter Ranch was different in ways that were hard to name individually but unmistakable in aggregate. Holt Carver had taken over the north pasture rotation with an efficiency that had measurably improved the cattle's winter condition. Ed Briggs had, without being asked, begun training the 2 youngest ranch hands in the kind of quiet, Thorough competence that was his particular gift to pass on. Margaret had expanded to 5 days a week and had stopped pretending this was a temporary arrangement. The kitchen had a new table. Clara had found it at an estate sale in town, a long, solid table that fit 10 people, and she had bought it with her own wages, and she had not asked anyone's permission. She had told Samuel about it afterward, expecting some version of an objection. And he had said, "Is there room?" And she had said, "Yes," and he had said, "Good," and that had been the end of it. Florence Dean had written twice since the hearing, once to report that the restitution proceedings were moving forward, once simply to say that she had planted a kitchen garden this spring for the first time in 3 years because it had seemed worth the effort again. Clara wrote back both times. Roy Sutton had sent a brief note saying his water rights were restored and that he was expanding his herd in the spring. He had added, at the bottom, a single sentence, "I told my wife about you. She says thank you." Archie and Ida Pell had driven out to the ranch one Sunday in October, unannounced, with a pie and no particular agenda, other than to sit at the kitchen table and talk, which they did for 2 hours. Ida had looked around the kitchen and said, "You've made this into something," and Clara had said, "It already was something," and Ida had smiled in the way of a woman who understood exactly what that meant. Gerald Harrow's criminal proceedings had begun. It would take time. These things always took time, but Crane wrote regularly with updates. And the updates were good, and Clara had filed each letter in the same organized way she filed everything. In a small cedar box she kept on the kitchen shelf. Robert Finch had resigned his position the morning after the hearing. He had not been seen much in Grover since. Cecil Golt had received a suspended sentence in exchange for his full cooperation. His surveying license had been suspended for 2 years. He had written Clara a letter that was 8 lines long and did not say thank you anywhere in it. But the 8 lines said something more specific than thank you, and she had understood them and had written back in kind. The proposal happened on a Tuesday, which was not a dramatic day and was not chosen for any particular reason, which was, in hindsight, exactly right. They were in the kitchen after supper. The hands had gone. The lamp was low. Clara was going through the ranch accounts. She had taken them over in September, because she was better at them than anyone else, and they both knew it, and Samuel was mending a piece of harness at the other end of the table, which was his version of an evening, the kind of work his hands knew well enough that his mind could be elsewhere. He set the harness down. He said, "Clara." She kept her eyes on the accounts for one more second, finishing the number she was on, and then she looked up. He said, "I'd like you to marry me. Not because the ranch needs managing, or because things are better with you here. Although both of those are true. Because I want you to be here. Because this is yours as much as it's mine, and I'd like that to be real. Not just something we both know." He paused. "And because I have spent the better part of a year trying to find the right moment to say this, and I've decided there isn't one. So Tuesday will have to do." Clara looked at him. "Tuesdays are fine," she said. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," she said. "That's a yes." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had come to know, well, not a smile exactly. But the thing that lived underneath his smiles, the thing that was more real than the smile, and rarer. He picked up the harness again. She went back to the accounts. She got 3 lines further before she set the pen down and said, "Samuel, I want to say something, all right." She looked at the accounts. The lamp, the cedar box on the shelf, the long table that fit 10 people. She looked at all of it and then at him. "I came here with nothing," she said. "Not just in terms of what I owned, in terms of what I believed I was allowed to have. I believed I was the kind of person who moved through other people's lives and left them unchanged and moved on. I believed that was just what I was." She paused. "And then you told me to eat my full portion and take my full wage. And somewhere between that and a county clerk's office and a man named Golt in a boarding house in Harrogate. I stopped believing it." He had set the harness down again. "I'm not the same person who came through that gate," she said. "And I know that's partly me, and I know I would have gotten here some other way eventually. But it was faster because of this place. Because of you." She looked at him. I wanted you to know that I know that. The kitchen was quiet. Samuel Carter, who was not a man of many words, said, I know. Then he said, Clara, the accounts will still be there in an hour. She looked at him. She looked at the accounts. She closed the ledger. They were married in November. At the ranch, because that was where they were. Margaret baked 3 pies and cried openly, and apologized to no one. Ed Briggs wore his best coat, which Clara had not known he owned. Holt Carver stood as witness and signed his name in the register with the careful hand of a man taking the responsibility seriously. Florence Dean came from Billings, sat in the front row, and looked like someone who had traveled 2 days to see something she'd been waiting for. The ceremony was short and plain. The vows were the standard ones. Clara said each word of hers with the deliberateness of a woman who meant every syllable and was not going to rush through them, not from hesitation, but because she had waited long enough to get here, and she was going to feel every word on the way through. When she paused on the word home, I take you, Samuel. To be my home, the pause was intentional. She felt the word. She let it sit in the air for a moment. Samuel, watching her face, understood the pause. He waited. Then she finished. Outside afterward, in the cold November air, with the mountains pale in the distance and the smoke coming from the ranch house chimney, an older woman from town who had come with Florence Dean looked at Clara and asked, in the way of someone making cheerful conversation, Are you the owner's wife then? Clara looked at Samuel, who was standing 6 feet away talking to Holt, and who caught her eye across the distance with that expression that was underneath smiles. She looked back at the woman. I'm the woman who finally found where she belongs, she said. The woman smiled politely, not entirely understanding. That was fine. It wasn't for her. It was for Clara, who had walked through a gate 8 months ago with a suitcase held together with twine and a lifelong habit of making herself small, and who stood now in the cold air of a November morning, outside a ranch that was hers, next to a man who had told her to eat her full portion, and meant it, and who was for the first time in her memory exactly the right size for exactly the right place. Patch pressed against her leg. She put her hand on his head. The ranch held around her, solid and permanent, exactly as it would tomorrow and the day after that. Home.